Doesn't matter who's the first to do it, it matters who's the first to do it right. And when it comes to this style of screamo or post-hardcore or whatever you want to call it, I think they were the first to just really nail that with translating the name. What's up everybody, I'm Finn McKenty, this is the Punk Rock MBA, and welcome to the very first installment of a brand new series, How They Changed the Game. This series is going to be where I talk about bands that weren't necessarily big enough for me to do a How They Got So Big video, but did do something interesting that I want to talk about, something that changed the game in terms of their music, their ideas, their marketing, or something else that I think needs to be discussed. I'm a big fan of bands that kind of just come out of nowhere, blow everybody else away, and end up defining an entire genre with one release, and in this debut episode, I'm going to talk about a band who did exactly that, Saosin. When the Translating the Name EP came out in 2003, as I'm sure a lot of you guys remember, it kind of changed everything. Like overnight, there was this entire subgenre of bands who were essentially just copying that EP. And in this video, I'm going to unpack all of that, including a detailed look at exactly how Saosin influenced the genre and why their specific version of this sound was so special and had such an impact. Before I do that, I want to give a special shout out to Beau from Saosin for his help on this. He was a guest at the conference we put on last month, the URM Summit, and he was gracious enough to let me corner him and interrogate him for about an hour on this. But that said, these are my words, not his, so if there's anything you don't like in this video, you can blame me for that, not Beau. And with that out of the way, let's get into it. Every so often, an album comes along that's kind of like the shot heard around the world, an album that just completely nails a genre or a sound and immediately spawns a million copycats and becomes the standard by which all others are measured. For example, Slayer's Rain and Blood for thrash, NoFX's Punk and Drublic for skate punk, or Converge's Jane Doe for metalcore. And in my opinion, Saosin's first two releases were exactly that for the mid-2000s post-hardcore or quote-unquote screamo sound. In fact, as far as I'm concerned, all those bands on Rise and EVR with the noodly riffs and a vocalist who mixes high-pitched cleans with screaming should probably have to pay royalties to Saosin because the influence is just that strong. And to put a finer point on exactly where Saosin's impact was the biggest, I think that era of post-hardcore or screamo or whatever you want to call it has basically two flavors. Let's call the first flavor mild. This is like the more rock version of the sound that did have some screaming, but it wasn't nearly as intense, as chaotic as the other flavor. Bands like The Used or Hawthorne Heights would be good examples of the mild flavor. And while Saosin was certainly influential among these bands, this isn't exactly what I'm talking about in this video. What I'm talking about is the other flavor, and let's call that other flavor spicy. This is the heavier, more metallic, angsty version of the sound as played by bands like Drop Dead Gorgeous, Scary Kids Scaring Kids, and From First to Last. And this is where Saosin wasn't just influential, they were the influence. They were the template for this whole cohort of bands. And in case you haven't listened to any of these bands in a while, here's what I'm talking about. Here's a clip from Saosin's Translating the Name EP. As compared to Drop Dead Gorgeous, Scary Kids Scaring Kids, let me out, and From First to Last. And just to be clear, I'm not calling any of these specific bands rip-offs of Saosin, I'm just saying that you can't not hear the Saosin influence. They actually weren't the first band to do this flavor of post-hardcore. As a few examples, A Static Lullaby and Funeral for a Friend put out similar releases in 2003, the same year that the Translating the Name EP came out. Finch put out a similar kind of album in 2002, and as early as 2001 you had From Autumn to Ashes, and of course Thursday with their big album, among other bands that were kind of doing something along the same lines as what Saosin did on the Translating the Name EP. So they weren't the first to do it, but Saosin were the ones who perfected it, in my opinion. They were the ones who brought the total package, the first ones to execute it really well and get the kind of traction that you saw with that EP. It's kind of like the iPhone, which wasn't even close to the first smartphone, but was the first smartphone that executed on all the details and became the template for all the others that followed. Much like, in my opinion, the Translating the Name EP was the template for all the quote-unquote spicy post-hardcore bands of their generation. So that was part 1 of the video, Saosin's impact, which brings us to part 2, which is, I think, the meat of the video. This is where I want to shift gears and talk about why Saosin had the impact that they did. What specifically did they do differently from everybody else that caused this EP and album to take off the way that they did? Well, first, let's talk about the EP, because even though the Beatle album was bigger in terms of sales, it was the EP, in my opinion, that really kicked things off, and in many ways is the more influential release, I think. First, a little bit of history and context about the EP. The main thing you need to understand is that this EP was Beau Burchell's baby 100%. Beau is the guitarist in Saosin, as well as the founding member and the primary songwriter. It's basically his band. So what exactly do I mean by that? Well, he wrote all the songs, he put the band together to play the songs, he recorded the EP himself, he even released it himself via Smart Punk. And nobody actually really knows exactly how many copies it sold, but it was definitely several 100,000, which is a massive number for a self-released EP like that. So if there's ever a Scene Hall of Fame, then we should definitely petition to have Beau Burchell inducted as the father of screamo. Somebody, please start a change.org petition. The world needs this. Anyway, the reason why I think all of that is relevant is because it's kind of an example of this pattern that you've seen in so many other cases where these game-changing releases in any given genre are oftentimes one specific person's vision. And don't get me wrong, the rest of the band definitely deserves some credit, as I'm going to talk about in a minute, but it was Beau's vision, 100%. And I think oftentimes the biggest creative breakthroughs happen like that, when one person has a very specific vision that they bring to life. As a couple other examples, Periphery. Periphery is Misha's band. It's Misha's vision. Black Flag was Greg Ginn's band. A Day to Remember is Jeremy McKinnon's band. You see what happens when one person has that unique, singular vision and gets to bring it to life with as few creative compromises as possible. And on that note, one detail that seems minor, but I think may actually be pretty important, is that Beau was 25 when he did Translating the Name, whereas a lot of other bands in the genre were teenagers, which means that while a lot of them were kind of unclear on what they wanted to do, and they were stumbling around trying to figure things out, as all teenagers are, Beau had been in bands for years already, and he knew exactly what he wanted to do and how to do it. He had a very specific vision of starting with his influences in the older emo bands like Sunny Day Real Estate and Mineral, but making that much more chaotic, more intense, and, well, emotional than anything anyone else had done in the genre before. And on that EP, I think that's exactly what they did. And as far as how they did that, there are a couple key things that I want to call out. First, the drums. The drums on that EP are just so much more crazy and over the top than what people were used to hearing in that genre. It was really more like metal drumming. Here's an example of what I'm talking about. Like I said, very metal, and again, that was no accident. Beau wrote all those drum parts and got a session drummer to play them on the EP. The average listener may not consciously notice it, but those crazy, frantic drums add so much energy that to me was missing from a lot of those earlier bands. I actually remember hearing 7 Years for the first time and thinking like, dude, that drummer needs to calm the fuck down, which I now realize was exactly what Beau was going for. And the second thing is a metallic edge to their riffs that really borders on metalcore. Here's a couple examples of what I'm talking about. Especially when combined with those very metal drums with all the double bass, which was definitely not a common thing at that time in the genre. This took them a lot closer to basically the metalcore side of things as compared to the Used or Thursday. Listening to them now, these almost sound like they could be Trivium riffs or something. Like, that's how metal they were. And to my point earlier about how it was a team effort, it definitely helped that Beau recruited Justin on guitar, who was just way, way better than 90% of people in any similar band in the genre, and he could pull all that stuff off with the crisp precision of a metal guitarist, which I think was really key to bringing that vision to life. And last, but obviously not least, is Anthony Green. He was without a doubt the magic ingredient that brought Beau's vision to life in a very special way. Even though listening to it now, I can hear that his performance is a little rough around the edges in some places, for example, the song Translating the Name, that really doesn't matter. What matters is connecting with your audience emotionally, and very, very few people do that better than Anthony. There's just something about his voice on that album that makes you feel something, probably because he was going through so much intense shit at the time and that came through in the performance. But more than that, he's just one of these guys that was born to be the front man of a band. If you've ever been around him, you know that his charisma is just off the charts. You can't help but like him and want to be his friend and love everything that he does. Like, he could read the dictionary and I would smile and laugh and think it was the most clever, charming thing I've ever heard. That's the power of his charisma. And as I've talked about in a lot of other videos, that charisma is what makes a truly great frontman or woman. People like Ollie Sykes or Haley Williams that are just magnetic like that. And to put a finer point on it, yeah, maybe From Autumn to Ashes or Finch did something musically similar to the Saosin EP a year or two earlier, but can you name a single member of those bands? I can't. That is the power of a mega charismatic frontman like Anthony, and it's oftentimes the difference between a band getting traction or getting forgotten. And as most of you probably know, the EP was Anthony's only recording with Saosin before he quit and started Circa Survive and was replaced by a guy named Cove Reber. And I think comparing Anthony and Cove really shows you what Anthony brought to the band. No disrespect to Cove, but he just doesn't have the star power that Anthony does. And even if he's technically a better singer than Anthony was, his performances just don't connect with you emotionally like Anthony's do. And speaking of Cove, although I don't think he was nearly as good as Anthony, their debut album was very influential in its own right, partly because it was one of, if not the first album in that style to be on a major label, which meant that it sounded just way better than pretty much anything else in the genre, thanks to an insanely big major label budget that no band would get today. For example, they spent 6 entire weeks just on vocals, which is ridiculous. Nowadays, you'd probably spend a few days or at most a week if you had a really big budget, and they spent 6 whole weeks just on vocals. They had the major label resources, and you can hear it. That album sounds fantastic. But the bottom line is this: even though, in my opinion, Anthony is the better frontman on both the EP and the album, they just executed better than anybody else had. Again, they weren't the first, but they were the first to do it that well. They're two somewhat different sounds, but in both cases, they did those sounds better than anyone else in the genre had before, and the results speak for themselves. That is why they got so much traction. And one quick note before I go, I don't think this is necessarily the key to their impact or anything like that. They would have been successful either way, but I do want to call out that they were actually really ahead of their time in terms of social media and internet marketing, and that definitely helped them, especially in the early days. They were hustling on Friendster, they did a bunch of live streams, like from Hurley, for example, when nobody else was doing stuff like that. And the thing I remember most is their Sao TV vlogs, which they were doing 10 years ago. And if you watch them now, they're actually still on YouTube. These aren't too different from what a modern vlog is, and honestly still ahead of what most bands are doing now. So there you have it, my thoughts on how and why Saosin changed the game with that EP and their debut full length. The main takeaway here to me is execution. Like I said, they weren't the first band to do this. Thursday had similar riffs a couple years before. From Autumn to Ashes had similar vocals a couple years before. But what they did was put it together into a package that in total was executed better than anybody else had done it. It doesn't matter who's the first to do it. It matters who's the first to do it right. And when it comes to this style of screamo or post-hardcore or whatever you want to call it, I think they were the first to just really nail that with translating the name. And if you made it this far, I would also love it if you joined my Facebook group. There's a link in the description below. It's a place for cool people like you guys watching this video to talk about music and work and life and all that kind of stuff. 100% positive, no trolls or shitty, elitist, snobby attitudes allowed, period. I have a zero tolerance policy. If you're a spammer or if you're an asshole, I ban you immediately. So if that sounds like your kind of thing, then I'd love to have you in the group. Again, there's that link below in the description. And with that, I'm going to sign off for now, but I will see you next time.